Welcome. This is session 9. Today we will be talking about the divided kingdom. In the book of 1 Kings, we read these words. When Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah found him on the road. Ahijah had clothed himself with a new garment. He tore the new garment into 12 pieces, and then he said to Jeroboam, "Take for yourself 10 pieces. God is about to tear the kingdom away from the hand of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes. One tribe will remain his for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city that I have chosen out of all of the tribes of Israel. This is because he has forsaken me and has not walked in my way as his father David did. Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom away from him, but I will take the kingdom away from his son and give it to you, that is the 10 tribes. Yet to his son I will give one tribe, so that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city I have chosen to put my name in." The story of what happens after the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon is a very interesting, in many ways very sad story of what happens after the united monarchy, or after the united kingdom. In 931, Solomon dies and the kingdom is split. Ultimately, as we'll see in just a few moments, the 10 tribes to the north will form the northern kingdom, Israel, and they will be captured and swept away in 722 BC. The southern 2 tribes, Israel, will last about 150 or so years beyond that, and until they are ultimately taken away into exile in 586 BC. So these stories are really, it sounds like a lot of it is going to be about the rise, the fall and demise of a king, and certainly it is. But beyond all of that is the same kind of theme that we have seen as we have come into this session. We've seen this for a number of sessions now. And that is this. This is what holds all of these stories together. It has to do with the covenant of God. Are people being faithful to the covenant? In the case of today's stories particularly, are the kings upholding and being faithful to the covenant? And on the other hand, how does God respond to that? When there is the breach of the covenant, breaking of the covenant, how does God speak to that? How does judgment unfold? And how does this story of 2 kingdoms even happen? And how do these 2 kingdoms end up in different places and with very different kinds of destinies? So let's just kind of sketch out how this story unfolds and what happened. After Solomon's death, the king appointed was Rehoboam, and the people wanted to send a message to Rehoboam asking or requesting him that the terms of labor, the heavy labor that they had known under Solomon, be reduced, that there just be some relief from that. Solomon, of course, had built the temple, and he had conscripted individuals, working them like slaves. The labor was heavy, the project was long, it was toilsome, and the people were seeking some relief. So Rehoboam received the request from the people, and in response to that, he sought advice. He gathered the elders and asked them what they thought about it, and he gathered his friends, some of his young contemporaries, and he asked them what they thought. The advice of the elders was to honor the request, to actually lighten the load of those who had worked so hard under Solomon. But oddly enough, the advice of his contemporaries, of his friends, was that the labor actually be increased and the workload be greater than even what it was under Solomon. So Rehoboam sided with his contemporaries on this particular issue, and he sent word up to the northern tribes, and as they heard and received this word, they rose up and revolted. They killed the official that Rehoboam sent to tell them this word, and as a result of that, the kingdom was just divided. The 10 northern tribes formed together their own nation, leaving the 2 southern tribes to be theirs. Rehoboam was still the king of the 2 southern tribes of Judah. And the 10 northern tribes then are going to select their own king. So they choose Jeroboam to be their king. And as the story starts out, it looks like in the very beginning of the story that this might turn out to be a very positive thing. God chooses Jeroboam. This whole thing somewhat has echoes of Moses about it. The people have been in oppression. Jeroboam is going to offer them relief, and he's going to lead them out of the oppression that they had been used to. But unfortunately, the story takes more of a turn from Moses kind of toward Aaron. And the whole story that had happened years ago when the people had requested of Aaron that he build for them, make for them a god as Moses was up on a mountain. And as you recall the story, the people brought him their gold and jewelry, and from all of that, he made a golden calf. Well, Jeroboam did the same thing. He kind of reinstituted that golden calf kind of culture, and what he did obviously was evil in the sight of God. And unfortunately for the 10 northern tribes, of all of the successive kings, altogether there were 20 kings from 931 through 722. Not a single one of those kings did what was right in the eyes of God, and every single one of them were noted for the evil that they had done. As part of that whole story of the 10 northern tribes, kings in the north ultimately created their own capital, Samaria. They created also or established a couple of places other than Jerusalem where people would worship so that they would not go down to Jerusalem. And so the story just kind of became its own kingdom story, a story that is going to just peel off in some ways from the stories of the southern kingdom. So, of all of the kings of Israel, their stories are fairly horrific. 7 of them were assassinated. 1 of them commits suicide. 1 of them is stricken by God. 1 is deposed by the Assyrians. The notable king in all of that series of kings is Ahab. And Ahab gets a significant amount of storytelling time throughout this section of the book of Kings. And it was Ahab who practiced child sacrifice. It was Ahab, his wife Jezebel, participated in killing of the prophets, in Baal worship. It was Ahab who looked at Naboth's vineyard that was adjacent to the palace area, and he just wanted that particular, and Naboth wouldn't sign it over to him. It was in his family for perpetuity, and as a result, Naboth has him killed and just takes his vineyard from him. It's also in the days of Ahab and Jezebel that we see the emergence of Elijah the prophet. As the prophets begin to give voice to these stories, and as you read of the prophets, their role in all of this is to remind Israel and Judah, some of the prophets will be sent to the north, some to the south, to remind them that their whole story rests on the covenant itself. And when and where they breach the covenant, they're going to face the judgment of God. So now we have one of those stories in which a prophet emerges, and he does so in the context of Baal worship. This is the prophet who actually challenges the prophets of Baal and Asherah, and 850 of the opposing prophets show up on Mount Carmel one day. They set up an altar, a sacrifice is placed on the altar. The prophets of Baal pray, even cut themselves bodily in their excitement to get their God's attention and to have that God to respond by consuming the offering that has been offered to him on the altar. Time passes, the day is going by, and there's God is just simply, or their God is not responding. Elijah offers his sacrifice, even pours water on it. He asks God to send fire, and that does happen. As a result of that, the 850 prophets of Baal are killed, and this incredible contest kind of has some reflection, or kind of reminds us a little bit about what happened when Moses went to Pharaoh, and the contest that happened there between the gods of the Egyptians and between the God of Moses, Yahweh. Same kind of story here. The God of, the assumed God of Israel, Baal, and the God that Elijah represents, Yahweh. So there's the incredible contest of what happens with all of that. Ultimately, the Assyrians advance upon the 10 tribes of Israel, and they confiscate them, take them back to Assyria in 722 BC. And after that, the individuals or the tribes that were captured and swept away were never able to come back to the land, never able to be reconstituted as a kingdom again. They were just assimilated. They lost their land, they lost their identity as a people of God. Their entire story, quite honestly, just gets lost in this. And it is just an amazing thing to think that a story that we have been talking about for some time now, in which 12 tribes of Israel have finally come, and they have been settled in the land. 10 of those 12 tribes are now gone forever, never to be restored, never to come back, never to set foot in that land again. And now we have a story that has really come down to the 2 remaining tribes. So, in the 2 remaining tribes, there is an assessment of the kings, and as mentioned to you, the southern kingdom will outlast the northern kingdom by approximately 150 years. And there's a lot of the same kinds of things. There's still the practice of idolatry among a number of the kings of Judah. However, there are a couple of moments in which it looks like this story might get itself rightened up and heading the right direction, and it looks like that there might be a breakthrough with a king or 2. So the assessment for all of the kings of Judah is very simple. Number 1, do they follow God? They will be assessed as to whether or not they follow the ways of Yahweh. And secondly, do they remove the high places, or the places where idolatry has been practiced? Among those kings, there are 2 that are certainly notable. One being Hezekiah. Hezekiah is loyal to God, and it is because of the loyalty of Hezekiah that when the Assyrians advanced on the 10 tribes and able to subdue them and carry them off, that when they came to the city of Jerusalem, they were not able to advance on Jerusalem. And it was while Hezekiah was reigning as king, that God, in fact, himself, and remember, these are stories about what, the battle is the Lord's kind of thing. The angel of the Lord came as the Assyrian army had encamped itself around the city of Jerusalem. And as the morning sun came up, the Assyrian warriors were laying dead in the fields or all about this, all outside the walls of Jerusalem. And 185,000 warriors were dead, and the king himself, the king of Assyria himself, went back to Assyria. So it was because of Hezekiah that God spared the city of Jerusalem, and it was because of Hezekiah that Jerusalem itself and the two southern parts, the two southern tribes and the kingdom of Judah did not get swept away with all that happened with the 10. It was also another king, Josiah, who offered another moment of hope. Hard to imagine, but during these times the temple was very neglected. And in the days of Josiah, the temple was in great disrepair, and Josiah ordered that the temple be repaired and that it be restored. And as workers were doing all of that, they actually found the book of the law. And amazing that this book had actually been missing for a couple or several decades. That is the degree to which the temple needed attention, the degree to which it had been totally neglected, the place in which, after Solomon built it, the glory and the presence of God just filled. And now, after these years, that kind of neglect of the place where God lived and the place that ultimately God left. And so Josiah now has in his hands the book of the law, and he gathers the people around the temple. And the law is read to them, and there is renewal, and the people declare when they hear the law, and there's the realization, and Josiah realizes just how far they had grown apart, how far they had gone away from the covenant. And as they hear these words of the law, they renew the covenant. And so there is this ray of hope that perhaps a permanent restoration, a permanent revival, a permanent renewal of the people will take place. But the renewal that did happen was short-lived, lasted for only a generation. For when the very sons of Josiah ultimately were of age, the evil that they lived out was just like the evil of all those who had gone before them. So that moment of hope dissipates. In 586, or around that time, the Babylonians come to Jerusalem, King Nebuchadnezzar, and he takes with him, or takes back to Babylon, those who are more of the upper class, those who are more cultured, and he leaves in Jerusalem the very poorest of the poor, oftentimes those who were in rural areas and poor farmers. So Nebuchadnezzar comes and he confiscates the people, and they are taken back to Babylon. 10 years later, King Zedekiah from Babylon comes and he finishes off the job. He destroys and burns the temple all the way to the ground. The walls are destroyed, homes are destroyed, land is destroyed, and the remaining people are then taken back to Babylon to live in exile. So we have an amazing, although a very dark story, in that after the reign of the three kings, we now have seen that with the division of the kingdom, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, the days are very dark. Ultimately, each of those two kingdoms, north and south, are defeated, one to the degree that they never recover. The other kingdom, the other two tribes, are taken into exile. So, as you gather and talk about this, you may want to talk about God's covenant and what it means to be faithful to the covenant, and the realization that this is not about military might. Again, this is about people being faithful to the covenant. Talk about how God used the Assyrians and the Babylonians to actually establish or to carry out his judgment for those who had breached the covenant. And so you might have some great insights about that. You might enjoy a conversation about just the slender thread of promise that remains throughout these stories. 10 of the 12 tribes are gone. We have Jerusalem. We have a promise that God has made to David. Only a couple of those kings, or several of those kings, are actually good kings. And in all of that context and culture of stuff, even with the continued practice of idolatry, God is remaining faithful to his promise, and the story and the dynasty, the family of David, kind of just somehow survives all of this. So you'll enjoy a conversation about how God works when so many tribes are lost, how God keeps his covenant in the context of just a couple of tribes that are remaining. And perhaps you would gain a lot by talking about what it means to be in exile. The people of Jerusalem and of the south are now in exile, and yet exile becomes one of the prevailing images in the Bible, something of God's people. So you might want to just locate in the Bible where you see the themes of exile, how you see God working in that, and have a wonderful conversation about us as a people of God today. In what ways are we an exiled people of God in the world? So I hope you have a wonderful time as you explore the story of the divided kingdom, and as you then talk about how what you learn together from those stories influence the very people of God that we are today.